We're going to be talking about sharpening today. So the first thing you want to do is, if you have a honing rod like this, I like to use it a little bit differently than other people. So I like to hold it, knife in one hand, honing rod in the other. And what you do is you really carefully but confidently just throw it away. So what is sharpening? In a nutshell, sharpening is you're just removing metal. So if I draw a cross section, whop. So this is the cross section of a dull edge right here. This is where we want the edge to be. All we're doing is we're removing metal here and here. So you're gonna take off this metal and this metal right here. And then you're gonna end up with an edge right there. So the thing with sharpening is you have to remove metal. A lot of people, they'll be like, well, I don't want to sharpen my knife because it's going to take off metal and it's going to remove some lifespan of the knife. You have to remove metal. If you don't, you're not sharpening the knife. I don't know what you're doing. So how do you know when you have actually removed enough material and actually hit that edge? Like, we know theoretically, if you just like erase some metal and erase some metal, you're eventually going to hit the sharp edge. But when you're actually sharpening and you're putting the knife to the stone, it could be a little bit trickier to tell how far to go and when you've actually sharpened the edge successfully. So what happens is, let's say you're sharpening the knife and you're sharpening this side right here. So you're putting this side on the stone and you're removing metal. What's going to happen is, as you're removing metal, you're also going to be moving some metal. And you're going to create what's called a burr. So this is a little sliver of steel that hangs off the opposite side. And you can actually feel it, and if it's big enough, you can see it. Ideally, we're going to remove enough metal. So if I'm sharpening on this side right here, I wouldn't be able to get a burr on the opposite side all the way along down from the tip to the heel. That way I know I've hit the edge all the way down the length of the blade. If I don't get a burr all the way, then I know in some sections I can actually go a little bit further because I haven't gone far enough. I want to also be able to feel the burr on both sides. What I mean by that is, when I'm sharpening, I'm going to be flipping sides pretty frequently, and that's just so that I don't want to remove too much metal on one side unintentionally, so that I'm just sharpening one side and the other side is very asymmetrical. So when I'm sharpening the knife, let's say this is going to be the stone right here, and I'm doing my passes, eventually I'm going to get that burr and it's going to come off right here. I want to feel across the edge to feel that burr. I don't want to go along because you're going to cut the shit out of yourself. And then I'll flip the other side, flip the burr, and then I'm going to do the same thing. This time feeling with my fingers and feeling for the burr. This is one of the most important cues to look for, because if you can't get a burr, then something's wrong. You need to reevaluate. Because if you're not getting that burr, you're not sharpening it, and you're just kind of doing the motions without actually sharpening. After you've created the burr, then next you're going to be removing that burr, because you don't want a weak sliver of steel in there. It's just going to flop off and then you end up with a dull knife anyways. So sharpening is going to be just simply removing metal, creating that burr, removing the burr, and then refining the edge as far as you want to. So before we talk about actually putting the knife to the stone, another very important cue is, how do you tell if your knife is actually sharp? So if you can't tell if your knife is sharp, you're going to be doing all this work and you can't evaluate your actual results. One test that I do is based on the micro teeth of the edge. And what I mean by that is, if I take a knife like this and I put it on the stone and I go through my motions, I'm creating scratches on that edge. And on both sides, you're going to have scratches that intersect, and they create these little tiny micro teeth. These micro teeth or micro serrations is generally what's going to make a knife cut well. Testing for sharpness is based on feeling for those micro teeth. So this is a test that I've learned from John at Japanese Knife Imports. He has a great channel. He's incredibly knowledgeable, and I get my stones from him too. So what I do is I take my thumbnail, and you're going to want to see how well those micro teeth tug on your thumbnail. You don't want to use a lot of pressure. So I'm just resting my knife on the thumbnail, and I'm seeing if it's going to just gently tug it. If it's dull, it's going to slide along. But this one's actually not sharpened, but it's thin enough where it will cut you. And so it's actually grabbing a little bit. You can see it's like tugging my thumbnail just a little bit. If I take a different knife, I don't know if this one's sharp or not.
It's definitely not.
So this one's not sharp. If I take this one right here, like, it's just kind of sliding along all over the place. Like, it's not sharp. That's the other very important cue to learn. So you need to learn how to feel for sharpness to be able to effectively sharpen your knife. Now we can actually start talking about technique. How do you even hold a knife and like what kind of motion do you do? The way I like to do it is I use my right hand for both sides just because I'm right hand dominant. You can flip hands if you want. That's just personal preference. This is a little unnatural to me, so I do both in my right hand. And the general motion is just kind of like a backward and forward motion like that. One of the important things is how you apply pressure. So for me, I like to apply pressure directly where I'm going to be taking off metal. So if I'm focusing on the heel, I'm going to be applying pressure right at the heel. If I want to focus on the tip, then I put my fingers right at the tip, like that. And as I'm going through and sharpening down the length of the blade, I'm going to be shifting my fingers. When you're first starting out, you don't really want to go really fast like this. You want to be as consistent as possible. You can set your angle, you can set where your pressure is going to be, and you do your motions like that. And then shift your fingers like that, check your angle again, and then go. And then shift over, check again, and then go. This is another thing where it's kind of personal preference. Everyone has their own technique, but I've seen a lot of really weird things out there. One common thing I see is kind of like this big sweeping motion like this, which that can work, but it's a lot more difficult to do right. One thing you have to think about is like how that pressure is applied. If you have a really thin knife and you apply pressure back here and here, you're actually flexing the blade a little bit. So the stone is only contacting the edge just in very small places. So that's difficult to get consistent. And it's also difficult to get consistent because this motion, already I'm just trying that and I'm getting this kind of like weeble wobble action just slightly. And that's gonna be hard for me to kind of like dial in and troubleshoot if something goes wrong. I've seen some other whack stuff too. I've seen like people doing circles, and you can do whatever you want as long as it's consistent. So most of the time, I'm gonna be doing my passes on one side. So I'm gonna speed this up just a little bit. So I'll do my passes all the way down. I'll feel for the burr like that. And then I'll flip to the other side, and then I'll do that again. I don't want to be taking off too much metal on one side at a time because I don't want to unintentionally create asymmetry in the blade. So when I do the passes, I'll check for the burr again. And I'll keep doing this and I'll feel for the burr both sides to make sure that I eventually creep up and get that burr. I don't want to take off too much. So the goal is you only take off as much as you need to. This is where feeling for that burr and getting really good at that is really important. And then I also want to make sure that I feel the burr all the way down. So there's going to be sections where it's going to be a little bit weaker, the burr is going to be smaller, and then some sections where it's going to be a lot bigger. So that's another thing to kind of like look out for is you don't want to be taking off too much material in certain places relatively to others. When you're first starting out, I recommend going slower. So be very intentional with what your motion looks like. What I mean by that is don't just set it on there and kind of go, because if you do that and you just kind of like set it and go and not even think about your motions, you might introduce like this rocking that's very common for people when they're like starting out. And that can get you a sharp edge, but you have no idea what angle that is. Like it could be anything, and you might be making the edge thicker than it needs to be at the actual cutting edge. So what I recommend is for angle, it doesn't really matter. The most important thing is consistency, like I've said before. What you could do for a good reference is set it like this: 90, 45, 22.5. That's a good starting place right there. Good angles can be anywhere from like 10 degrees to 22 degrees. It really depends on your knife. It really depends on your kitchen, the way you maintain things, the way you cut, all these variables. So you can't just have one angle be like the perfect one, because there's no such thing. A really thin hard knife, if you bring it to a super thin edge, it's gonna cut really nice, but it's also gonna be very fragile. So like I said, when you start your motions, when you start practicing, 90, 45, 22.5. And then feel for that, like kind of remember what that feels like. I use my thumb as kind of a guide. So this is, I don't know, 3/4 height on the spine. And I'm just gonna use that thumb and I'll remember it. So I'm gonna be setting my angle. So I set the knife down, I set my angle. I'm gonna remember that. It doesn't matter which angle as long as you go back to that as best as you can every single time. So I'm gonna go. Most of the pressure is gonna be on the backside, just for consistency. Go back forward, go back. And every time I go back to my starting location, I'm feeling for that angle right there. Feel for the angle, and then feel for the angle. And then when I need to move forward, shift, check again, feel for the angle. If you want to do your reference checking again, you can, and then you do your motions. And then again. Most knives will taper towards the tip, so you have to account for that. You can't just, this is much less wide right here, so that angle reference isn't going to be correct. It should be here, but if I use that same thumb feeling, it's much higher. So you have to visually check and build that muscle memory. Another thing that I want to talk about is the angle that I hold it relative to the stone. You can hold it perpendicular to the stone, but you get more stability when you hold it diagonally. This is due to the natural motion of your arm, and also you get a larger footprint on the stone. So if it's just here, you've only got this much width, but if you turn it, it's much wider base and it's gonna give you more stability. So I like to hold it diagonally relative to the stone. The last thing we're gonna talk about is stones. So it's gonna be really confusing, like which stone to get, what grit, what material, what lubricant, whatever. It's one of those things where it doesn't really matter too much on the specifics. A lot of people recommend 1000 grit just for starting out, just for your general purpose sharpening stone. This is a good recommendation because it can do pretty much anything you need to when you're first starting out. And it's a medium enough grit where if you're going ham and you're sharpening like this, and you've realized, oh wait, I've held that at the wrong angle, or I hit it at the wrong place, 1000 grit's not that aggressive. So you wouldn't have really messed up anything in your knife. If you went a lot coarser, like 400 grit or something like that, and you did that, now you might have to like go back and repair the knife, or go back and reset angles and all that kind of stuff. You don't really want to go to a really coarse grit until you build that muscle memory. And this is where 1000 grit comes in. So this is a 1500 grit splash and go stone from Japanese knife imports. It's a little bit finer than 1000, but it cuts quick enough for me where I really like it. Once you get comfortable with using 1000 grit stone or something maybe a little bit finer, then you can start to think about other stones to add to your setup. If you find that, let's say you have some knives that really need some more work, they're super dull, they've been neglected for a long time, you might want to invest in something that's coarser, like 400 to 600 grit. And that'll let you remove metal faster, and then you can progress to a higher grit stone afterwards. Or if you've been using 1000 grit stone for a while and you find that it's still a little bit too toothy and you want something more refined, then you can go higher grit, like 5000 and 6000 grit. But a good starting point is 1000 grit stone. I really like these splash and go stones from Japanese knife imports. They cut quick, they don't dish that fast, they feel good, they just use water, and to me, they're a decent price. One stone that's kind of recommended a lot is like the King 1000. It's cheap, it'll work, but they are thirsty, you have to soak them a lot, and they do dish pretty quick. So it's trade-offs. It really depends on what you're looking for. So I'm gonna sharpen this knife really quick. So like I said, I'm gonna set 90, 45, 22 and a half. I'm gonna go a little bit lower because that's my preference, and I'm gonna remember that angle. I'm just gonna go through my motions. And I'm walking down the blade. My fingers are still very close to the edge, so I can apply pressure where I want it. And then I'm gonna feel for the burr. I've got the burr down in this section, but not towards the tip. So now I'm gonna flip it just because I wanna make sure I sharpen it evenly. Now I'm gonna feel for that burr again. And I've hit it. So I've got a burr all the way down. So now I just need to remove that burr. And what you can do is you can do stropping motions. And that means edge trailing or the edge facing away from the motion. So I'm gonna go backwards with the edge facing forward. And I'm holding it at the same angle or maybe slightly higher. And it's really light motion. So basically like the weight of the blade itself. So I'm gonna start at the tip, edge facing forward, and then I'm gonna go backwards. And then I'm gonna flip over. And then I do the same thing. And this basically flips the burr back and forth and it weakens it. Kind of like when you take a paper clip and you just bend it back and forth. You're work hardening the burr and you're letting it become easier to remove. And if you do this enough times, you might see a burr fall off onto the stone, or it becomes weak enough where you can just lightly draw it through wood, through cork, through, I don't know, I've seen some other wacky stuff too. There's a bunch of different ways to remove the burr, and you gotta kind of find which one you prefer. So I'll do a few more stropping motions. And then check to see if I have any residual burr hanging on there. Just a little bit. And then lightly draw through wood. And then I'm going to check for the burr again. And again, I'm checking across the edge. I don't want to check the burr along because I don't want to slice my finger right open. And there's nothing there. I'm going to check for sharpness. Thumbnail test, see if it bites in. And you can see, like, I barely applied any pressure and it just grabs the thumb. And I'm going to check all the way down. There might be sections where it's not grabbing as much. Like right here's a little bit weak. I can sharpen that a little bit more. But otherwise, like right here is very, very toothy and good. And you want to check the very tip also. So that's it for sharpening. Like I said, sharpening condensed down is just metal removal because you need to remove that metal. Burr formation, that is one of the most important cues to learn, is forming that burr so you know that you've actually hit the edge. Burr removal so that you don't have this weak, flimsy sliver of steel there. And then refining the edge to however far you want to go. I think that's it. The next one we're going to talk about troubleshooting sharpening. So there's a lot of nuances to sharpening where it might be frustrating when you're first learning. So I'll talk about some tips, some things to look out for, just general technique to help you learn and to be able to sharpen your knives better and more effectively.
Yeah.